Now, critical to all that, so notwithstanding the policy pronouncements as part of this national strategy that exists today, and again, refreshed in a more specific tone than what we've ever seen in recent years, in the President's national security strategy articulated this past spring, it nonetheless is a question then of how do you accomplish this? It's great to see the policy objectives and the statements of what our national goals ought to be, and again, none less than the President himself being here in a week to articulate, I'm sure, as he is often prone to do, exactly the most expansive view of what the policy of the United States should be and why this is our national imperative. Nonetheless, there are elements, there are capabilities that are sorely needed to make any of that rhetoric true. And that's going to be the greatest challenge confronting, is in part one of the capabilities that is at the cornerstone, the foundation of the ability to do that, of free lanes, free access to navigable lanes across the globe, and particularly in the Arctic, is the ability to be able to do so year-round. And this ice-breaking capability is essential for fulfilling those Arctic responsibilities. Now, I mean, icebreakers, again, is an asset, it's a capability, it's an operational capacity to achieve an outcome. That's part of the mission. It's not unique to the United States by any means, of course, and it's one that, in turn, is recognized by every sovereign nation, every commercial interest, every national security-related kind of activity. They take all those factors into account to look specifically at the ability of passage. And no question, from a scientific and technical standpoint, that has become much more dominant part of our policy objectives as well. So all of them have come together on an economic, national security, and scientific basis in a way that has rarely been as firmly lined up as we see today. The catch is, what the capability requires a mobility and the capacity to actually be able to do that at all times of the year. The second feature that goes is a interoperability capacity and the means to use that capability along with commercial, national defense, any other capabilities that are engaged, and the ability to actually have an unimpeded passage in any of the isolated environments, particularly here in the Arctic. Now, and ultimately the resilience to a harsh condition. That calls for a very, very robust capacity relative to any other that we've seen. And that said, not all the Arctic missions, including ice-breaking operations, are what you'd classically look at and say, is that a public responsibility? It is, to the extent that you look at it from the standpoint of, again, derivatives of the very notion of law of the sea and passage from a capability of unimpeded commerce anywhere the U.S. chooses to go. That then does become a very strong public imperative. But that's a statement of what your objective is, not necessarily a dictate of how it must be carried out. So the means by accomplishing that task need not be, and isn't definitionally unique only to the public sector, to the government. The means to accomplish that is certainly being shared by lots of others who have no specific government affiliation, because they see the economic advantages to go forward as well as the commercial advantages to have that capability. So depending on the mission priorities, there are a variety of ways to meet those kinds of alternatives. And it is a useful way to start looking at this particular problem, given the fact that we really are under capacity right now and under capability right now to deal with the requirements overall. Just a scan of who's got what where, the numbers of what is capable of breaking ice in this environment. There's no question the Russians have dedicated themselves to this for quite a long time. This is not new to them. This is not a new national objective. This is not something that came up just in the last 18 months as a consequence of its president's articulation of force projection or anything else. This has been an ongoing capability that they have always paid attention to because of the way they look at those challenges. And again, this is not something that is a revelation to anybody here in Alaska. That's something that's been evident. It's part of the rich history of this state for a long time and the territory that preceded. So as a consequence, the Russian behavior in this regard is not something that is surprising. To the rest of the country and anybody else looking at these numbers, this would be viewed as a recent evidence of some effort on their part to try to reach as a stronger advantage in any commercial condition as an instrument of their own national policy. It's certainly facilitated by this capability, and it outstrips anybody else that's out there. The Danes, the Canadians, the Swedes, the Finns, all have capabilities that are, in most respects, more than our own. Indeed, it is not just governments that have these capabilities or national objectives. Royal Dutch Shell, as of next year, will have more ice-breaking capability than the United States has. Royal Dutch Shell, a oil company. Okay? There's no question. They are dedicated to this because they know this is part of the advantage they will have for continued access to commerce, economic benefit that comes from that, and the ability to actually follow through and yield those resources. So this is not something that's peculiar to any nation state or to any individual collective of people. So as a result, it is an operational capability to make those national policy objectives feasible from national security, energy, economic, commercial, all those other focus points, but also on the direction of any individual industry or corporation that has an interest in seeing the advantages of their own individual capabilities being advanced. Catch is the current acquisition strategy, what we employ in the United States to try to achieve a capability for icebreaking, given the fact that our focus, not just from a policy standpoint, but from an operational one, is that the United States owns and operates, as a matter of governmental public requirement, those assets for the purpose of those commercial, national security, energy, et cetera, benefits. So as a result, we've taken this on as a government responsibility. It has been so for some time, and we continue to adhere to that view. Now, the current strategy, as articulated, not by the strategy documentation this past spring, but by all the repetitive documentation from the United States government, from the budget of the United States, which, again, as Ted Stevens always taught me, you can always compare what is in the policy statement to what's in the budget. And if there's a match, you know somebody's serious. If it's not, you ought to wonder exactly how that's working. So our policy statements are very clearly articulated in this regard. The budget position in this is that, yes, this is a high priority, but every year it has to compete with lots of other things. And that's understandable. I mean, the Coast Guard capabilities to actually operate and maintain a fleet of these assets, in addition to everything else they do. And trust me, I have an up-close and personal understanding of what their capabilities are and deeply appreciate exactly what they are. All those priorities they have to compete for things like this, against things like this. And those challenges are serious. As you're looking at a traditional policy that under the current rules requires, if you want to buy a icebreaker, build one, operate it, have the Coast Guard operate it on behalf of all of us as the public to benefit on all those different policy objectives, then it's going to take 10 years and $1 billion, minimum. That's the going openers of what the proposition will be. And it'll take that long to design it, develop it, build it, and ultimately field and operate that asset to replace the ones we have right now, which are, by anybody's standard, getting pretty old. The drawbacks to those traditional procurements, I'm going to ask my colleague and good friend Dave Van Slyke, who at Syracuse University, that we worked on an analysis of alternatives and approaches to how we'd go about doing this, and looking at different ways you could achieve a capability like this. This isn't unique to icebreaking by any means, but it nonetheless is a good pattern or a path to try to exactly how to look at an alternative that would yield this operational capability under different scenarios, and to look at what the range of models could be and how we work through this. Now, Dave has not come to this from just an immediate kind of opportunity where he said, gee, we're looking at icebreakers, how would you like to work on a study of this? This is a guy who has spent a lot of time working these kinds of issues in the past. He is one of the authors of a book released just in the last year on complex contracting, of which the kind of government contracts of looking at capabilities like this was analyzed in terms of all the alternative management strategies that have been employed and utilized over that span. So he has delved into the financing of this question, the acquisition strategy of how it's working, and is uniquely qualified and has helped in an enormous way, along with Trevor and Zach, to put together what is a very comprehensive analysis of alternative that I'm going to ask him to walk through at this point. David?
So as Sean said, one of the things that we looked at was how to think about alternatives. And there are some examples that we can draw from. And part of our real interest was to think about, could we get faster fielding time? Could we get stronger agility in very unpredictable and uncertain environments? And could we also think about something that perhaps had different criteria and parameters by which the nation itself could benefit from additional icebreaker capabilities for all the reasons that Sean laid out? So we began to look around not only the United States, but we began to look at a cross-country comparative analysis of what is happening in terms of Coast Guard icebreaker capabilities in a number of other countries. We only need to look to our good colleagues to the east here in Canada to see that they have themselves experienced the use of a lease chartering approach to really think about buoy tendering services, clearing the parts of the St. Lawrence Seaway. The National Science Foundation, which as Sean highlighted earlier, has engaged in different lease chartering arrangements for some of their own research vessels that they've used. There are other examples from the Military Sealift Command that has used a lease chartering approach to do offshore petroleum discharge. And the Special Operations Command has also used a lease charter to acquire more privately owned vessels to be able to do some of their work as well. Now, we're not here to make an argument for lease. All we're saying is there is a precedent for this as one alternative. Rather, what we did was we looked at a series of alternatives. Our baseline is the traditional procurement strategy. So for any of you who ever have difficulty sleeping, the federal acquisition regulations are very short, 2,400 pages long, 6-point font, quarter-inch margins. And if you have any questions, don't call someone at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, because they too are unaware of just how much is in that. Those regulations serve as sometimes as enablers and facilitators for how to create better contract arrangements between government and industry. But perhaps more often, they also create a series of obstacles and impediments to thinking about how to acquire the assets that government needs to be able to fulfill their mission responsibilities. And no federal agency has a more complex set of mission responsibilities than the United States Coast Guard. And as some of you may know, the United States Coast Guard itself has a very different history in terms of the organizations that it has been under for a long period of time, from the Department of Transportation more recently to now the Department of Homeland Security. And so one of the things that we want to look at is, are there alternatives to think about this issue of icebreakers? Because as a number of you said, and Senator Murkowski said the other night, do we really need another study on icebreakers and whether we need them? But rather, Admiral Ostabo said yesterday, these are important inputs to all of the types of activities that we want to be able to operationalize as part of a more comprehensive Alaska Arctic investment approach. So we did, and we did, as you would expect any social scientist to do, we began to think about this analytically. And analytically, we had three elements. The first is, how many acquirers will there be? Will there be a single acquirer, like the government, and more specifically the United States Coast Guard, or would there be perhaps one or more, or even several? What would the acquisition process look like? Would it follow the traditional process? And the estimates that you saw of 10 years, $1 billion, that's for a single unit. But remember, whenever you build something for the first time, you have to build that entire production inventory. So unless you can bring it to some level of scale, you still have a lot of sunk costs involved in that kind of operation. And then the third element, the third key element that we looked at, is the asset mix. What is it that we want this icebreaker to do? Do we want it, like the Polar Star, to have multi-mission capabilities and be able to do a number of things in addition to its icebreaking capability? Or might there be alternatives in which icebreaking capability itself is a single kind of mission focus? It is the sole asset mix for any new vessel. And as Sean suggested, there is the real question here about whether breaking ice, and only breaking ice, is necessarily inherently governmental. So we begin, of course, by looking at a set of criteria. And I won't go through these in all their definitions. I think a copy is available for you if you'd like, and will be posted, according to what Meade said, on the web for this conference. But we look at 9 different criteria here by which to judge these alternatives. And as Sean suggested, we didn't come to this with a predefined answer of what we think the right answer is, but rather how could we in fact compare across these alternatives. And so what you can begin to see for our criteria is that we focus on things like technical feasibility. Can we do this? How much new technology will this require? Can we do any of it with commonality, open architecture, modularity, or how much of this potentially exposes us to things like lock-in from a very proprietary set of technologies?